Bull versus lion. When strength meets fury, the incredible happens. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like and comment telling us where you're listening from. Dr. Sarah Kimathi had worked at the Masai Mara Wildlife Conservancy in Kenya for 12 years, but she'd never received a call quite like the one that came through on her radio that morning. A bull, a domestic Boran breed worth considerable money, had somehow escaped from a nearby Maasai settlement and wandered deep into lion territory. Worse, it had been spotted near a pride's kill site, and the pride's dominant male was circling the intruder with clear, aggressive intent. Sarah grabbed her emergency kit and jumped into her Land Cruiser, Marcus, her Maasai guide and tracker, already waiting in the passenger seat. "How did a domestic bull get 5 kilometers into the conservancy?" she asked, as they bounced across the savannah at speed. "The boma fence was damaged in last night's storm," Marcus explained. "Several cattle got out, but the herders managed to recover all except this one. He's a breeding bull, apparently. Very valuable. The owner is offering a reward if we can get him back safely." Sarah's mind raced through scenarios, none of them good. A domestic bull, raised around humans and other cattle, would have no experience with predators like lions. It would be terrified, unpredictable, and potentially aggressive toward anyone trying to help. And a male lion defending his territory and recent kill would be equally dangerous, seeing the bull as either a threat or a potential meal. They crested a rise, and Sarah immediately spotted the situation. About 200 meters away, in a clearing dotted with acacia trees, a massive white bull stood his ground. He was enormous, easily 800 kilograms, with impressive horns that curved forward in sharp points. His head was lowered, his body tense, facing off against a male lion who was circling slowly, his dark mane catching the morning light. "That's Scar," Marcus said quietly, identifying the lion by the distinctive mark across his muzzle. "He's the coalition leader, 4 years old, in his prime, very aggressive, especially around his pride's territory." Sarah grabbed her binoculars, assessing the scene. The lion was magnificent, probably 190 kilograms of pure muscle and predatory efficiency. His eyes were fixed on the bull with the focused intensity of a hunter. But he wasn't charging, wasn't committing to an attack. He was measuring, calculating, trying to determine if this strange creature was worth the risk. The bull, for his part, was standing remarkably still. Sarah had expected panic, wild running, the kind of behavior that usually got prey animals killed. Instead, this bull seemed to understand that running would trigger the chase instinct. He was holding his ground, his horns pointed toward the lion, his eyes tracking the predator's every movement. "We need to intervene before this escalates," Sarah said, reaching for the tranquilizer rifle. "If Scar attacks, that bull will either be killed or injure the lion badly enough that it could affect the entire pride. And if we intervene and the bull charges us," Marcus asked pragmatically, "domestic cattle can be more dangerous than buffalo when they're frightened." Sarah knew he was right, but they couldn't just sit and watch. The bull's owner was part of the local Maasai community, people who coexisted with the conservancy and whose cooperation was essential for conservation efforts. Losing a valuable breeding bull to a lion would damage those relationships, potentially leading to retaliatory killing of the predator. She was reaching for her radio to call for backup when the situation changed. Another lion appeared from the tall grass, a female from Scar's pride, attracted by the commotion. Then another. Within minutes, 3 lionesses had joined Scar, and now the bull was surrounded by 4 predators instead of 1. The bull turned slowly, trying to keep all 4 lions in his sight, but it was impossible. They were spacing themselves strategically, as lions do when hunting large prey, preparing to attack from multiple angles. Sarah's window for intervention was closing rapidly, but then something extraordinary happened. The bull, instead of showing fear or aggression, did something Sarah had never witnessed in any bovine. He began to vocalize, but not in the panicked bellowing you'd expect from terrified cattle. This was different, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed almost like communication, like he was trying to talk to the lions. "What's he doing?" Marcus whispered, as transfixed as Sarah. "I don't know. I've never seen behavior like this." The lions responded to the unusual sound by stopping their advance. Scar, in particular, seemed confused. He'd hunted buffalo, Cape buffalo that were wild and aggressive. He'd faced down elephants and hippos. But this creature, similar to buffalo but clearly different, was doing something unexpected. The unfamiliarity made him cautious. The bull continued his vocalizations, and gradually his body language shifted from defensive to something else. He lowered his head further, not in aggression, but in what Sarah recognized from her years studying animal behavior as a gesture of submission or peace. He was making himself less threatening, trying to communicate that he wasn't a challenge to the lion's dominance. Scar took a step closer, and Sarah held her breath. The lion moved within 3 meters of the bull, close enough to strike, close enough that a single leap could put his claws into the bovine's vulnerable throat. But Scar didn't attack. Instead, he did something equally unusual. He sat down, just sat there, his tail flicking, his eyes still fixed on the bull, but his body language no longer overtly aggressive. The lionesses, taking their cue from the pride's dominant male, also sat or stood down from attack postures. The tension in the clearing shifted from imminent violence to something else. Standoff, perhaps, or mutual assessment. Sarah couldn't quite define it, but years of observing wildlife told her she was witnessing something rare. "Are we seeing what I think we're seeing?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking normally might break whatever spell had fallen over the animals. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "that Bull is using some form of interspecies communication. He's telling the lions he's not a threat, not prey, not competition. And incredibly, they're listening." She had her camera out now, filming everything. This kind of behavior needed to be documented, studied, understood. The scientific implications were enormous. Cattle were generally considered to have limited cognitive abilities compared to wild ungulates, but this bull was demonstrating social intelligence, communication skills, and emotional regulation that challenged those assumptions. The standoff continued for nearly 20 minutes. The bull remained in his submissive but watchful posture. The lions maintained their positions, neither advancing nor retreating. Occasionally, Scar would make a low vocalization, and the bull would respond with his own sound. It looked for all the world like a conversation, though what information was being exchanged remained mysterious to the human observers. Then one of the lionesses stood, stretched, and simply walked away, heading back toward the kill site Sarah could see in the distance. Another followed, then the third. Only Scar remained, and he and the bull continued their locked gaze for another few minutes before the lion also stood, gave the bull one last long look, and padded away after his pride. The bull didn't move immediately. He stayed in position, watching until the lions were well away, ensuring they weren't circling back. Only then did he lift his head fully, shake himself, and begin walking, not in a panicked run but in a purposeful trot, in the general direction of the Maasai settlement he'd escaped from. Sarah and Marcus sat in stunned silence for a moment before Sarah started the Land Cruiser. "We need to follow him, make sure he gets back safely. And we need to understand what just happened." They tracked the bull at a distance, keeping him in sight, but not approaching closely enough to spook him. The animal seemed to know where he was going, moving with confidence, despite being in unfamiliar territory. Twice more they spotted predators, a clan of hyenas and a leopard, but in both cases the bull's behavior was similar. He'd stop, lower his head slightly, make his vocalizations, and the predators would watch him pass without attacking. "This bull has some kind of gift," Marcus observed. some understanding of how to communicate with predators that I've never seen in domestic cattle. Where did he come from? When they finally guided the bull back to the Maasai settlement, they met the owner, an elder named Ole Sankale, who'd been frantic with worry over his lost animal. But when Sarah and Marcus described what they'd witnessed, Ole Sankale nodded with something that looked like recognition rather than surprise. "That is Amani," Ole Sankale said, using the Swahili word for peace. "We call him that because he has always been different from other cattle. When he was a calf, he was raised alongside a group of orphaned animals at a wildlife sanctuary. His mother died giving birth, and the sanctuary took him in. He lived there for his first year with baby zebras, a young gazelle, even a lion cub whose mother had been killed by poachers. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. He was socialized with wild animals. He learned their body language, their vocalizations, how to communicate across species barriers. The sanctuary eventually closed due to funding," Ole Sankale continued. "We took Amani back, and he's been our breeding bull for 3 years, but he's always been unusual. He doesn't fear wildlife like our other cattle do. He's curious about wild animals, interested in them. We've seen him standing at the fence watching zebras, making sounds like he's trying to talk to them." Sarah asked permission to study Amani, to document his behavior and abilities. Ole Sankale agreed, proud that his bull had such unique qualities. Over the following weeks, Sarah set up camera traps around the settlement's grazing areas, recorded Amani's vocalizations, and observed his interactions with wild animals that came near the settlement. The data she collected was extraordinary. Amani had developed what could only be described as a multilingual ability in animal communication. He could modify his vocalizations to mimic aspects of different species' calls. His body language incorporated elements from various animals he'd been exposed to as a calf. Most remarkably, he seemed to understand the social structures of predators, knew how to approach them in ways that didn't trigger aggression. Dr. Sarah published her preliminary findings in a wildlife behavior journal, and the response was immediate. Researchers from around the world wanted to study Amani. The story caught the attention of mainstream media, and soon the Peace Bull of Kenya was internationally famous. But fame brought complications. Conservation organizations wanted Amani moved to a sanctuary where he could be studied more intensively. Research institutions offered substantial sums to Ole Sankale for the bull. Even a documentary film crew arrived, wanting to create a program about Amani's unique abilities. Ole Sankale refused all offers. "Amani belongs here, with our community. He is not a curiosity to be studied in captivity. He is a bull who has found a way to live in peace with the predators that surround us. That is a lesson we all need, Maasai and wildlife alike." Sarah respected this decision, but she also saw an opportunity. If Amani could coexist peacefully with predators, could his behavior be studied and somehow replicated to reduce human-wildlife conflict? The Maasai lost dozens of cattle to lions each year, leading to retaliatory killings of predators. If there was a way to teach cattle to defend themselves without violence, to communicate with predators in ways that reduced conflict, it could transform conservation efforts across Africa. She proposed a long-term study to Ole Sankale and the Maasai elders, one that would document Amani's behavior in detail and attempt to understand the mechanisms behind his abilities. More importantly, she wanted to see if Amani could teach other cattle his techniques. Could his offspring inherit or learn these unusual skills? The elders agreed, seeing the potential benefit for their community. Over the next 2 years, Sarah and her team conducted the most comprehensive study of bovine-predator interaction ever attempted. They documented hundreds of encounters between Amani and various predators. They recorded his vocalizations and had them analyzed by bioacoustics experts. They studied his calves to see if they displayed similar abilities. What they discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence and learning. Amani's skills weren't instinctive. They were learned behaviors, acquired during his critical early developmental period at the wildlife sanctuary. But more remarkably, he was actively teaching these behaviors to his offspring and even to other cattle in the herd. Young calves would follow Amani when he encountered wildlife, watching his responses, mimicking his vocalizations. The other adult cattle, initially fearful, gradually began adopting some of Amani's techniques. The entire herd became noticeably calmer around predators, less likely to panic and run, more likely to use Amani's communication methods. The results were measurable. Ole Sankale's cattle losses to predators dropped by over 60% in 2 years. Other Maasai herders began requesting breeding services from Amani, hoping his offspring would bring similar benefits to their herds. The Maasai community that had once seen lions as enemies began to view them differently, as animals that could be communicated with, coexisted with rather than killed. Sarah's research attracted the attention of Dr. James Morrison, a leading animal cognition researcher from the University of Sydney. He traveled to Kenya to observe Amani firsthand, and what he witnessed convinced him that the scientific community had drastically underestimated cattle intelligence. "We've treated cattle as simple-minded creatures because that's how they behave in typical farm environments," Dr. Morrison told Sarah during one of his visits. But Amani proves that given the right socialization and learning opportunities, cattle are capable of sophisticated cognitive functions. Cross-species communication, social learning, even what appears to be cultural transmission of knowledge. These are abilities we normally associate with primates or cetaceans, not ungulates. The implications extended beyond cattle. If one bull, through unusual circumstances, could learn to communicate across species barriers, what did that say about the potential of other animals? How many species possessed latent abilities that were never expressed because their environments didn't demand or allow them? Amani's fame grew, but the bull himself seemed unaffected by the attention. He went about his duties as a breeding bull, grazed with his herd, and continued his peaceful interactions with the predators that shared his landscape. The encounter with Scar and his pride had been dramatic, but it was just one of hundreds of similar interactions that Amani navigated successfully. Scar, interestingly, seemed to remember Amani. Sarah documented several more encounters between the lion and the bull over the 2 years of her study, and in each case, Scar approached but never attacked. The recognition appeared mutual, and there developed what could only be described as a relationship between predator and prey that defied normal categories. One particularly striking incident occurred during a severe drought when prey animals were scarce and lions were desperate. Scar's pride successfully brought down a young zebra near where Amani's herd was grazing. Typically, cattle would flee from such close proximity to an active predator kill. But Amani, after his initial assessment of the situation, led his herd closer to the lions rather than away. Sarah watched in amazement as Amani positioned his herd in a semicircle around the pride while they fed, close enough to observe but maintaining a respectful distance. The lions, focused on their meal, tolerated this unusual audience. When they'd finished eating and moved away to rest, Amani investigated the remains of the kill, his nose working. He then vocalized to his herd, and they moved on, apparently satisfied that the immediate danger had passed. "He's teaching them," Marcus observed, "showing them that lions are most dangerous when hunting, less dangerous when feeding, and least dangerous after they've eaten. He's passing on survival knowledge that could benefit generations of cattle." The success of Amani's herd inspired a broader initiative. Sarah, working with the Maasai community, several conservation organizations, and the Kenyan Wildlife Service, developed a pilot program called the Coexistence Project. The goal was to create socialization opportunities for young cattle, exposing them to wildlife in controlled settings that could teach them the kinds of communication skills Amani had learned accidentally. Several Maasai communities volunteered to participate. Young calves were taken to specially designed enclosures where they could observe wild animals from safety, learning their behaviors and vocalizations without risk. Older animals who'd already been socialized, including several of Amani's offspring, were introduced to these herds to serve as teachers and role models. The program wasn't without skeptics. Many traditional herders thought it was foolish to intentionally expose cattle to predators. Some conservationists worried it would create habituated animals that were more vulnerable rather than less. But the early results were promising. Herds that went through the program showed reduced stress responses to predators, lower panic-related injuries, and significantly fewer losses to lion attacks. Dr. Morrison, fascinated by the implications, secured funding for a long-term study comparing predation rates across participating and non-participating herds. After 3 years, the data was conclusive. The Coexistence Project herds experienced 47% fewer predator-related cattle deaths than control herds. More remarkably, incidents of retaliatory lion killing by Maasai herders dropped by over 70% in participating communities. What Amani started, Sarah told a conference of conservation professionals, has evolved into something much larger. We're not just reducing conflict between cattle and predators, we're fundamentally changing the relationship between pastoral communities and wildlife. We're proving that coexistence isn't just an idealistic goal, but a practical reality when we give animals the tools to communicate across species boundaries. The international recognition that followed brought resources and attention to the Maasai communities involved. Ecotourism operators began offering specialized tours to see Amani and observe the Coexistence Project herds. Visitors from around the world came to witness cattle grazing peacefully near lions, hyenas, and other predators, attracted by a story that offered hope in a world where human-wildlife conflict was typically characterized by loss and violence. Amani himself, now 6 years old and still in his prime, had sired over 200 calves. His offspring were spread across multiple Maasai communities, and reports suggested that many of them exhibited enhanced communication abilities with wildlife, though none quite matched their father's remarkable skills. Ole Sankale, in his 70s now, had become something of a celebrity himself, interviewed by journalists and documentary makers about his famous bull. But he remained grounded in the traditional Maasai values of living in balance with the land and its creatures. "Our ancestors knew how to coexist with lions," he told Sarah during one conversation. "We lost some of that knowledge as we adopted modern ways, as we began to see wildlife as enemies rather than neighbors. Amani has helped us remember what our great-grandparents knew, that there is a language between all living things, and when we learn to speak it, peace becomes possible." 5 years after the initial encounter between Amani and Scar, Sarah returned to the site where she'd witnessed their first meeting. The landscape looked much the same. Golden grass stretching to the horizon, acacia trees dotting the savanna, the eternal drama of life and death playing out across the Maasai Mara. She sat on the hood of her Land Cruiser, watching the sunset, thinking about how much had changed. The Coexistence Project was now operating in 4 countries across East Africa. Amani's story had been featured in major documentaries and scientific publications. The principles his behavior had illustrated were being applied to other human-wildlife conflict situations around the world. Movement caught her eye. A large white bull, unmistakably Amani, was leading his herd across the plain, and walking parallel to the cattle, about 50 meters away, was a lion with a distinctive scarred muzzle. Scar, now in his 9th year, still ruled his pride, though age was beginning to show in his gait. Sarah watched as bull and lion walked in the same direction, neither threatening the other, maintaining their respectful distance. It was a perfect visual representation of what they'd achieved. Not the elimination of the predator-prey relationship, not the removal of all risk, but a new understanding, a way of sharing space that honored both cattle's right to safety and lions' right to exist. The sun dropped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Amani reached a watering hole and his herd began to drink. Scar stopped on a nearby rise, laying down to rest, his dark mane silhouetted against the fading light. Predator and prey, sharing the same landscape, each aware of the other, each respecting the unspoken agreement they'd somehow established. Sarah pulled out her phone and called Dr. Morrison in Australia, knowing he'd want to hear about this scene. "You asked me once if Amani was an exception, or an indication of potential that exists in all cattle," she said when he answered. "I think I finally have your answer. He's both. An exceptional individual who showed us what's possible, and proof that when we give animals the opportunity, when we create the right conditions, they can exceed every limitation we've placed on them." She drove back to her research station as night fell, her headlights picking out the eyes of animals moving in the darkness. Somewhere in that night, Amani was bedding down with his herd, safe despite being surrounded by predators, protected not by fences or weapons, but by something more powerful: understanding, communication, and the choice that both cattle and lions had made to seek peace instead of conflict. And in that choice, in the example they set, was a lesson for all species, including humans. That intelligence takes many forms, that communication transcends language, and that even the oldest of enemies can become, if not friends, at least something better than adversaries. They can become neighbors, sharing a world that's big enough for everyone when we learn to speak each other's languages and respect each other's needs.